University. We're here with Jim VanderMoere to talk about his experiences during World War II. So I'd like to start out by asking about what you were doing before the war, like a little bit about your childhood and your folks and things like that.
Yeah, okay, I was born and raised in Grand Rapids and went all the way to grade school and high school. And I was in high school and had turned 18 in January of '43, and the draft was going on pretty steady there. So a lot of guys were being drafted right out of school if they wanted or if they needed them. But our principal decided that maybe he could keep the guys in till June in graduation. So he went to the draft board and got excused for all the guys that were going to come out, graduate in June, which would then be 18 or a little older, be ready for the draft. So that's what we did. So I got out, graduated from Grand Rapids Central High School on June the 11th, 1943. And on June 22nd, 1943, I was in Great Lakes Naval Training Station. So that's the preliminary going in the Navy right there.
Quite a culture shock right out of high school.
Yeah.
Do you remember being affected at all by the Great Depression, growing up during the Great Depression?
That's interesting that you would ask that. Right now we're having some serious times in the talking about depressions, and I compare notes with some of the people. I was fortunate in our family. My dad was an office worker. He worked for the trust company. He had worked in the bank and then worked for Metropolitan Life Insurance. And I think at that time he had been working for the Grand Rapids Trust Company. So he always had a job, not a big, wealthy, paying job, but we were always comfortable and weren't having all the problems that I hear a lot of the other people saying. They didn't have food and they didn't have rent and they couldn't get heat. And we never suffered that, but we knew a depression was going on.
And you remember Pearl Harbor?
Yes, I do. That very vividly. I mean, that sticks in your memory. I remember we were at home on a Sunday afternoon, and they interrupted a radio broadcast, and they started to say that Pearl Harbor was attacked, and we probably had never heard of Pearl Harbor up until that time, but from then on, everybody knew at Pearl Harbor, and from then on, it was a steady diet of what was happening in the war.
And had you been following the news, like the world news back then, like even before Pearl Harbor? Did you have a sense of what was going on around the world with World War II?
I was quite young, and I don't in '41, say I would be about 15 or 16, and I probably was aware, but we didn't follow it closely and paid a lot of attention to it.
Okay. Now, when you were in high school during World War II, was World War II something that you talked about in high school?
Oh, that was very vivid there. But we had a lot of friends that were already leaving school and going in the Navy. I had a very good friend that he dropped out of school and went, and if I had known he was going to do that, I would have probably tried to get my mother to let me go too. But there was a lot of fellas going, and then all the teachers and the gym classes and stuff, they said, you're going to be in the Army or the Navy. So we used to do a lot of exercises. We run around the block and get like physical training, getting in shape is what we were doing. So we were pretty much aware of what was going to happen and getting ready for it.
Was there a sense of fear when you were in high school, or were just as a young guy you were ready to take it on? You didn't really fear?
I don't think when you're that young, fear enters in too much. It's more like an exciting thing that you're going to experience, and you probably don't face the facts that it might be fearful if you did.
And when you were drafted by the Navy, or were you drafted like by the government?
It's just the Kent County Draft Board. I remember very vividly, we chummed around with a bunch of kids, and there was one fellow about my age. We both had gotten a notice in the mail that we had to appear for an exam because we were eligible for the draft. And so at that time, we had to go to Detroit for the exam. So we caught the railroad train up on the north end off from Plainfield, the old Grand Trunk Railroad. We rode to Detroit on the train. So the two of us were going to go. And we had a third fellow that was a good chunk friend of ours. He was a little younger, and he really didn't have to go. We said, why don't you go with us? You're going to go in a couple of months anyway. And so we talked him into going with us. So we went on the train to Detroit and went all through the physical exam. I was in pretty good physical shape, but when they got to the final thing, when they looked at my paperwork, the blood test that they submitted was maybe, I believe it was 90 days. It had to be current, had to be within 90 days, and it was older than that. And they said, we got to teach those draft boards. They can't do that, so you're rejected. You've got to go back and get another blood test. And the friend that went with me, he couldn't pass the eye exam, so he was rejected. The fellow that we talked into going, he passed. So when we got back on the train, he was the only one who was gonna go, and we were both rejects. But I just went and got another blood test and then went right on, but the third fella never did go with his eyesight, you know. But
The guy who was drafted and accepted, did he immediately have to go, or did he get a chance to go back to Grand
yeah,
Rapids?
no, he wasn't called up right away, but he was eligible to be called. That's what the draft said, you're eligible to go, you know.
And then, did you choose the Navy, or
Yeah.
were you assigned, you chose the Navy?
When you got to the draft board, when you got all done, you got to at the final lined up, everything's in a line. It got to a desk. There was an Army, a Navy, a Marine. I think there was three. There might have been a Coast Guard, but I don't recall that. But I know there were three, and it depended on if their quota was full, you didn't have a choice. But if they were all eligible, you could say which one you wanted. And I wanted Navy anyway, so I just said I elect Navy. So that's how that went.
What was it about the Navy that attracted you as opposed to the Army?
I don't know, just something about my bringing up. When I was a kid, I was in Boy Scouts. I wasn't a very strong Boy Scout, but I enjoyed the outdoors, and I was a Boy Scout. Then a little bit later, I went in the Sea Scouts. We had a Sea Scout patrol downtown Grand Rapids, and from there, it just was natural going to the Navy after that.
And, you know, once, okay, you go back, you get your blood test, then you go, and what, they first send you to like boot camp or basic training?
Yeah, from Grand Rapids, everything was working out of Detroit. So our high school graduation class, wartime was going on strong, so I believe, I might be off a little bit on the figures, but I believe out of our high school graduation class, I think I had maybe 10 or 11 guys in my boot camp company when I finally ended up there. But those guys had already passed their paperwork and everything, so they were in the pipeline, and I was a little bit behind. So I had to go back and get my blood test, and then I had to hurry to say I want to catch up with those guys. So they said, all right, we'll get you there. So I went down to the bus station to catch a Greyhound bus to get to Detroit, and they'd already gone on a train or whatever there. So I caught up with them in Detroit after two of us rode the bus down there, and that way.
And where was boot camp?
That's Great Lakes, Illinois. That's still there. That's the big Navy training station north of Chicago on the lake shore up there.
Do you have any memories of boot camp? Was it
Oh,
particularly
yeah,
rough?
very vivid memory. It was a lot of physical training, and it went through all just the basic little stuff, the knot tying and first aid a little bit, and a little drilling, and a lot of exercises. They wanted to get you in shape and everything.
Do you remember it being especially hard, or was it just something you were able to deal with relatively
I think
easily?
you'd have to say it was strenuous, because you went out on a drill field, and of course you had a boot camp company. I don't know how many guys you had in that company, maybe 75 or so, and you all fell out in the morning, and you marched over to the drill thing, and you did your exercises and everything, and then you ran around the drill field, and you got a lot of strenuous exercise getting you in shape. And it was hot. It was in June and July, so it was hot weather.
Oh yeah, Chicago can get scorching hot. What were the sergeants like? Were they particularly abusive? Were they fair?
We wouldn't call them sergeants. We just had a chief petty officer who was I wouldn't even call him company commander, because he was not a part of it. He was just the head of the boot camp company. And as my recollection is that these fellows were all probably college men that maybe just graduate or almost graduate, so they just kind of made a position for them and gave them a chief petty officer rank, so they would take care of these companies. And they were always fair, but they were just a little bit above us, and a little bit older too. But in boot camp, during this time of drafting, we were all 18, but we had some married guys that had children. That just the facts were such, and they were married, and we had a couple of older guys that they really couldn't cope with this exercises, and I believe they dropped out and they just couldn't do it.
Well, how did that work? Could you drop out?
No.
Or they had to throw you out?
If you were going through these exercises and you could see the guy just couldn't, say you had to run around the drill field, he just couldn't make it. After enough of that period, he would see this happening day after day, and they probably just said, this man's not going to be able to make it. So they put the paperwork through, and they just sort of eased him out. We never heard a lot about it.
And then you complete boot camp, and then what next? Where did
Well,
they send you next?
when you got nearly to the end of boot camp, they gave you a choice. What would you like to do? I mean, you have a choice. Not everybody went to school, but I think, yeah, you always had to take aptitude tests. I think they looked at the paperwork. If you were competent to go to school, they probably gave you the choice, and if you weren't, you just went directly to an outgoing unit and went on a ship someplace along the way, or fill in some, but they asked you, what would you like to do? And well, I always enjoyed hunting and guns, so I said, I'd like to be gunner, or I used to work with motors, I like to be a motor machinist, or my friend who had gone, he was in the aircraft, patrol bomber, he was a radioman, I said, like that too. So they gave you just a preliminary test. I don't think it's very professional, because it was just a seaman, to give me a test for this. And he said, your aptitude is okay, but your balance is not right. You can't be an aircrew member. So that was crossed off. And then it could have been gunner's mate or a thing, and it ended up being going to diesel school. So you had a choice, and you had a selection, and that's where I ended up.
So you wanted to initially be in the planes. You wanted to.
Yeah, because he was. That's the only reason. I thought, well, that sounded good to me. So I said, I'll go in the air end of the Navy. But I think I could have done it. But they give you I don't know if you had to keep your eyes closed and stand on one foot or something like, just sort of a balance thing. And said, no, you're not qualified. But this guy, an 18-year-old guy, gave me that test. I don't have much faith in it, but they did.
And so then you went to diesel school.
Yeah, just down the street in Chicago. It's still Navy Pier. It's a recreation pier now out in the lake. You got 10 days leave out of boot camp, and then you reported right back down there to Navy Pier. That was a big school in those days. They had cooks and baker schools and aviation machinist thing and diesel. I believe there were 500 men in our company, so there was big business there down there. It was a good school. We had all the basics of it was small diesel stuff, really what it was, and governors and small diesel engines, and then the instructor in the school. This is how it ended up leaning towards the submarine thing. He said, now at this stage of the war, landing crafts are the big thing. We're having a lot of invasions, and we have a lot of landing crafts, and most of the landing crafts, the smaller ones, are going to have small diesel engines. That's the kind you've been working on. The little bigger ones have little bigger diesel engines, but they're still landing crafts. So the chances are that you fellas here, well, you know, if we had 500 in our company, maybe only had 25 in a class because they were broken up small. He said, yeah, most of you guys will go in the landing craft, probably. But he said, what we're going to have an option here is you can volunteer for submarine duty. Now, and this is what's struck to me, being a howler. He said, you get more pay. I said, that's the first thing. You get the best food in the Navy. I was a kind of a chow hung. That sounded pretty good to me, too. And I said, I think I'll go that way. So out of all the guys in our company, of 500, I don't know how many volunteered, but quite a few, they took 50. 50 fellows out of the company were eligible to go into submarine school. That's where we went. Bennett and I were both in that same group, so we left.
Did you have an awareness of how dangerous the submarines were?
I don't think danger was so much just too young to really recognize real danger. It was exciting and a lot of action, I guess you would call it that too. But I don't know that we I'd heard submarine stories in movies or whatever, but I don't think we recognized the danger so much as just being adventuresome and it had to do something anyway, and it sounded good.
Okay, and then they sent you to Spritz's, so-called Spritz's Navy?
Yeah, Spritz. Well, New London, Connecticut is the sub base, and Spritz's Navy would be the guys that you hit to first when you got there. That was just a name; they didn't call it that. But Spritz was the guy who was the chief in charge. He was tough and mean. I think he did this on purpose, just to keep you in line and just get you straightened out. So you tread a kind of a narrow line to make sure you didn't monkey around with Spritz.
And were there a lot? They were testing you to make sure you'd be suitable for submarine duty.
Yeah, you did go to a psychologist or a psychology man or psychiatrist. Or I remember going there on a one-on-one interview, you know, and I'm sure he had questions that when he asked me, he knew what he was trying to get, and I was not aware of anything. But I remember one question very vividly. This was about the time of the year or in the season. Johnny VanderMoere was a pitcher, I think was Cincinnati, if I'm not mistaken, and he just pitched a no-hitter or one or two or something, And he said, VanderMoere, oh, are you any relation to Johnny VanderMoere? I remember that very vividly, that question, talking to him. But he just asked you about various things. And then you had some more physicals. You kept having physicals all the time, and you could have been passed out. They looked in your throat and your eyes and your ears, and every time you went to a new place. And you had to be in good shape to be in the subservice anyway.
Did a lot of people not make it through?
Yeah, I would have to say a fair percentage of them didn't. A lot of them, probably a few at health, and then some of them weren't very good in schooling and they dropped out, and some of them because of their actions or something. So you always had a dropout rate of how many guys you had. I can't give you a figure, but there was a fair amount. Not big, but a fair amount.
Was that more difficult for you than boot camp, or about the same?
It was a lot different. You had a lot more schooling. Boot camp, you had basic courses, but this you actually had classes. You had to do drawings and study the layout, and then you'd go down in the big shop where they had the great big diesel engines, and they'd start them up, and you'd talk about this, and then as you went through a little bit later, you go down to one of the old subs. We had the old, not S boats, the O boats and R boats. These are before S boats, and they're like maybe 1918, 1919, and rusty old buckets. You go out to Long Island Sound, and that's the first time you go on a submarine, a beat up old thing, I remember the first time I ever made a dive. It's little teeny boats, but they get out there and they were so old they had to be very, very careful what they did with them. So they'd come to a stop right in the middle, and then they sound the diving alarm, you hear that. And then they open up the vents, and I'm standing there, and I could just see the front of the boat. I'm looking down the aisle, and it's going down there. You only went down maybe 20 or 30 feet, but you got your first dive in an old O boat. Then you could progress to an R boat, which is a little bit better. And then a little bit later, you went to the bigger boats that were some of the fleet boats that had been beat up in service and came back, and they were just eligible for training rather than service. So we gradually got into the bigger boats.
So by the time you actually were serving on a sub, you knew these submarines quite well.
Yeah, you didn't know a lot about it, but you knew what they went about. And then when you got ready to graduate from class, there was several options, and one of the options was new construction. And that was always, I would have liked to have gotten that, and a lot of people I guess did. They took a certain nucleus of that, and they sent some of them to Electric Boat Company at Groton. Some of them went to Manitowoc at the Manitowoc shipyard, and some went out to Mare Island to the shipyard, and some went to Portsmouth. They just took a few, and that's how they got the crew. They got a bunch of new guys, not a bunch, a section of new guys, and then the guys that had been overseas and made war patrols, or 2 or 3 or 4, however, they got them out and sent them back to new construction. So between officers and men, you have some old and some new. You made a nucleus of a crew, and then as your boat was being built, you went down and saw what was going on, and then when it got big enough, you'd take it out in Lake Michigan if you were at Manitowoc and so forth, and that's how they got the crews.
And so what's your timetable after you complete the training at New London, the submarine training?
It was very quick from then. We just graduated, and in probably 2 days, 3 days, we're on a troop train heading across country. So we get all the way out to cross country to Mare Island Navy Yard, and that's a kind of a receiving station. And actually, I had a kind of a thing. I was going out on the troop train, and I saw a neighbor of mine coming the other way on a troop train. He was in the Army, and I saw him, I recognized him, and waved to him as we went past each other in the yard. I got out to Mare Island Navy Yard. There was a fellow from our high school that had graduated the year before me, and he'd been on a sub on the halibut, and he got all beat up, and so he came back. He was going to new construction, so I passed him going out too. But yeah, there are a lot of guys there. It's a kind of a big receiving station, and it's all done alphabetically. And Bennett's at the top of the list, and VanderMoore's at the bottom of the list. So each morning you'd fall out, and they'd take what they needed off the top and go right down the list. And one day Bennett's called, and he's got to get his gear, and he goes across the bay to Hunter's Point. Well, VanderMoere still stayed a day or two, and then they called and get your gear, and they got all your gear, and they put us on a bus, and we went down. I think we stayed overnight on Treasure Island. And the next day we went to the docks and put us on this Liberty ship, just one of those Liberty ships that they build, just We just slept halfway down in one of the holds with I'm just guessing maybe 50 or 60 guys in a draft. They weren't all submarine sailors, but I'd never been to sea on a Navy ship yet, you know, and this wasn't a Navy ship, but when I got there, I said, man, oh man, this was a really loaded, this was wartime, of course. This is a small freighter. It had a tugboat up on the deck, up in the bow, small tugboat. And then alongside, on each side, they had just piles and piles of, I call them telephone poles, but they were like pilings for docks, all creosote pilings and telephone poles. And then they had a wooden deck house here, which was the toilet, with seats, with running salt water there. And on this side, a wash basin and a shower with salt water. Then we went down below, and halfway down was where we had a little cooking outfit and pole bunks, canvas bunks. And then back of the deck house, they had two small, they're like small PT boats, but they were metal. They're landing craft control boats. Their crews were with them too, but they had those both mounted on the deck, and then some more deck cargo, not too much, but then the armed guard was the gun crew on the back, so it was well loaded. 28 days.
And where'd you go? You end up,
Milne Bay, New Guinea.
okay.
We did not see another island or any other ship until we got almost down there. We got a plane come over. We had a aircraft warning, so they manned the guns, but it was a patrol plane from us, and they just flew over and looked over, and then we pulled into Milne Bay Harbor.
Were you worried about Japanese submarines during this time?
I think we always were aware of everything, you know, that was going on, but I think maybe at the first, it was in the Pacific, so it would have been Japanese submarines, but I think they had them pretty well under control, but we didn't see anything. And
Would this have been, you know this was 44 when this was happening?
yeah, this would have been just the first part of 44 then.
Okay.
Back then.
Okay.
So, and the war had been on, the Japs had been pushed back quite a ways by that time.
And then what next? You get to New Guinea.
You got Milne Bay, New Guinea, and now you were in the jungle area, you know. The first thing you saw was palm trees, and boy, you went wild. The guys climbed the trees and got the coconuts and tried that coconut milk, and they got sick and everything. But then you had lots of guys, and it was hot weather, of course, and then malaria was the thing, so you had to take an Adabrin tablet every morning for that, so you got kind of a yellow pallor after a while. I wasn't there too long. I'm gonna guess about 10 days, or maybe 2 weeks, but not very long. But you'd have a working party, go and unload trucks of canned goods in warehouses, and just various working parties to keep you busy. And then finally, said, get your stuff together. We got on a small landing craft. They took us out in the harbor, and here come this great big HMAS Westralia. It was a big, like a cruise liner in the old early ones, but it had just come back from the landing at Hollandia. And so I can kind of date my time. If I know when the Hollandia landing was, I know that the time I was there. And so they hove to, and we got all our gear on board and went there. And I think maybe it was maybe 2 days or 3 days to Sydney, Australia. It's not a long distance, but I'm a little vague about the time. But it was quite interesting. You know, you were on a big ship, and you're way down, and this had been a troop carrying thing, so there just bunks all over the place, just pole bunks, you know, it's 4 and 5 high.
During this time, do you have an idea how long it's going to be before you're actually serving on a sub, or you're just waiting?
The Navy never tells you. They just keep shipping you around and stuff, you know. Like I said, I went from Grand Rapids to Australia, Fremantle. I've never been anything but school, just going on. And so when we got to Sydney, I only stayed there one night, and they put you on a train. Said, well, I guess, I don't know where. They don't tell you where you're going either, but there's not much far you can go. Australia in those days just had one rail line across, and the unique thing about it was that each territory had their own gauge. So you had 3-foot gauge here and 4-foot gauge, so you'd have to get your gear out of here and put it on the next train when you cross the line. And I don't know how long that was, 3 or 4 days probably, and you stop right out in the middle of the desert. The cook train had big kettles of mutton stew or whatever, they put it out, and then first thing you know, the Aborigine natives would show up, because they knew that's where they stopped. And you throw a crust of bread down, boy, they'd grab that. That was good for them. It was interesting. It was, you know, enlightening, but it was just different.
And then what's your destination at this point?
Well, we ended up in Perth, that's the
Mhm.
big city.
Yeah.
Perth is the city, and that's when you got off the train. And then we got on trucks and thing, and we go to Fremantle, which is maybe 8 miles. It'd be like the port, like Muskegon, if we're the inland city, and Fremantle's the port cities, that, from Perth to Fremantle. So, and then you just went, well, that's the first time I was assigned to a Navy ship. Pulled down to the docks, and the U.S.S. Orion was a submarine tender there. It was a nice, a modern tender, and so you went on board the tender, and you signed you a bunk. And of course, when you start there, they always got to have menial labor, so some of us would go on mess cooking, and some would do other duties. And after you did that a while, well, then you'd work your way into the relief crew, and then you'd be painting the ships or repairing valves, or whatever they needed, they'd turn you over with somebody that knew what they were doing to instruct you.
What's a submarine tender?
It's a huge vessel, has everything that you need to service a submarine. They had foundries, lumber woodworking shops, optical shops, electronic shops, and all kinds of gear like that they had, and actually it's made up of different groups. They had ship's company, which was the crew of the tender, which would run the boat if they were sailing, and then they had the relief crew, which would be the work of repairing subs. They'd have guys who were running the foundry and running the thing, or some of those foundry guys might be ship's company too, but the relief crew was we would be here and we'd work on the subs, doing the work on the subs. After they come in off of a run, see, they're kind of beat up, and a lot of paint is missing, and boards are gone, and so the crew gets 2 weeks leave, and they turn it over to the sub relief crew for 2 weeks, and then you do everything that's needed. So sometimes you have to repair 2 engines, or 1 engine, or 3 engines.
And so, how long were you doing that kind of duty?
I was in Australia, as near as I can recollect, about 8 months. You couldn't beat that duty. I mean, my friend Bennett, you know, we have Josh in together. He never got to Australia. I said, Bennett,
he said that.
did you ever get to see Australia? God damn you! He said he was on Majuro and Saipan and all those others. Gee, that Australian duty was really good. We had a kind of a nasty little saying that we had. We said, boy, that Australian duty is good. The beer is good and the girls are friendly.
Yeah, I've heard some other people talk very fondly about Australia.
Oh,
The people were really nice.
You could not get better duty anywhere in the world, I think, during wartime than that Australian duty. It was wartime, of course, and there was a lot of novel things. One thing that impressed me was, you know, they had gas rationing and food rationing and everything. And in the taxis, I don't know that all of them, but the majority of the taxis were not gas burners. They had a little charcoal burner stove on the thing, and had a big airbag on the top of the roof. So they'd stoke up the charcoal, and the gas that was generated from that car went up to this big airbag, and that's what ran the car. I'd never seen something like that.
No, yeah, you think like today with something like that.
Yeah.
And then, when did this duty end?
Okay, you know, after you were there a while, if you were smart, you'd say, this is the best duty in the world, I want to stay right here. But you see these subs coming and going, and said, you know, I'd kind of like to get on one of those things. And we had a group of guys in there who were doing engine work at that time, and there was a couple of other guys that said, you know, I think we're going to go out on one of those boats. And at that time, there was a difference. Well, there always was a difference, but like Bennett's boat, the Sunfish, that was a thin-skin boat, what we called it. It was like maybe, I'm going to guess a little bit, I think it was like a 300-foot depth is what they classed it. Well, then the new ones coming out, like the Blenny, they were the thick-skin boat, we called them. They were a little deeper. They were like 600-foot boats. And so my 2 friends in the thing said, we're going to get one of those Nui Deepies, the new one that could go deeper. So you kind of see the ones that are coming in and say, yeah, I'd like to get on that. And there was no specific way who got this one and that one, but if you knew the yeoman in charge, you'd say, hey, the next one comes along, I'd like to get in there. If you had a little pull with somebody, you could work that out. So I don't know whether that's how it worked out, but anyway, I had one fella in the relief. You know, a lot of guys wanted to go out, and I had a friend of mine in the relief crew. He went out on the Flyer. It came in, and the Flyer went out and hit a mine, and they all lost except 5 or 6 men, and he was one of them. And Bennett and I talked about that later, comparing notes, and he said, you know, the Flyer came into Hunters Point when I was there, and they took guys out of the relief crew and went on there. The Flyer was a new boat, and before it really got out on a patrol, it was in a bad storm going into Midway Island, and it tore the bottom out of it. So they had to go back to the Mare Island to get it fixed. And they took some guys, so Bennett didn't get on it. That's just a chance, okay? And it comes down there, and they're going to take some guys, and I didn't get on it. That's just a chance. And then it got lost. I said, you know, you just never know how it's going to fall on for you.
Mm-hmm. And so when did you eventually get on the crew?
I got on my boat on the 5th of February, 1945.
Mm-hmm.
And they always rotate some of the crew off, you know, they try to keep it fresh. And there's reasons for it. Some guys were weary, getting tired, and maybe they were getting a little bit concerned about depth charges or something, so they'd rotate some off for some reason or other. But a lot of guys wanted to get off in Australia because they knew that was good duty. So I think, if I figures right, I think we took about 15 fellas out of the relief crew and put them on the Blenny when they came in this time.
Do you remember your first patrol on the Blenny?
Yeah, I did, because it's all new then. Of course, this is wartime. If you visualize the map of Australia, we're down clear in the lower left-hand corner of Australia, and there was a possibility it could be Japanese subs, but they were pretty well patrolled because we had a lot of aircraft patrol all the way. So from Australia way up to the top of Australia, way up on the corner of Darwin, that would be the last place we could go in, but we didn't ever go in there. But from Darwin to the Malayan or the Indonesian islands of Java and Bali and Lombok, you had a place that you went through into the Java Sea. We always went through Lombok Straits, and it was a fairly wide strait. Bali was on an island of Bali, the island of Lombok, and that was the strait there, and it was kind of swift with current. They couldn't mine it, and it was deep, so it was fairly easy to go through, but they had patrol boats you had to dodge, but there were not mines there, so you'd get into the Java Sea, but that was like 1,000 miles to get there, you know. Then you're in the war zone, because you started patrolling, and you patrolled along, and you'd spend time at this place and that place, but we ended up to the western end, going up into the ocean, up by what we call it French Indochina, which is Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. It was just French Indochina in those days, and that was where we spent our time patrolling, the first patrol. And we had it was new to me, but we made an attack on a convoy, and it fired torpedoes, and we had a lot of torpedo problems during the war. They were bad, something was so bad. But these, as I understood, remembered the captain saying, those smoked, and they didn't go very run, and so he watched the torpedo run, but when he swung around to look at the Japanese destroyers that were there, here was one coming right at him, and they were firing the depth charges. They dropped some off the stern and fired some with the Y guns out the side. And they fired those Y guns, and he had to turn the scope up because this depth charge was coming right over the top. And so we got hit pretty good that time, and this is the first time I'd ever had any. I think recollection is maybe we had about 15 of them go off those times. And I was in the after torpedo room, and my war patrol time during an attack was a reload crew to help them reload torpedoes after they fired. So I was just sitting around back there, and when these things went off over the top, the light bulbs break and the glass is falling, and the pieces of cork insulation is falling. And what I remember the most vividly were two things. They had a little sink here that you could flip down to get water, and then they had a metal container that caught the wastewater. Didn't have plumbing, so that thing comes skidding across the floor from that thing. But through the hatch, we're in the after torpedo room now, and the maneuvering room was the next room up. And that's where all the electrical contacts are on the big cages. And this is the thing that sticks in my mind. When those depth charges went off, you have electrical contacts like that, lots of them. They go like this. So you just had like lightning going through the whole boat because these things are opening up with a concussion. Boy, that gets serious when you see that.
Was that the scariest, most dangerous moment you had yet faced or
I
experienced?
think that probably was. It was the first time, but I had not ever experienced one before. A little after that was over, I was up in the mess hall, and we had a cook that had been maybe 8 or 10 patrols, so he'd been around. I said, "Hey, Super, was this a bad one?" He said, "You dummy, if it was worse than that, you wouldn't be here." He said, I said, "Oh,
That was
okay."
bad. Yeah. So I guess he meant that was
Yeah.
real, it was a close call.
Yeah.
Wow. But you had success sinking a number of Japanese
Yeah,
ships in that?
we sank, let me see, I got it written down here, because I can't remember just which one. We sank, this was the one a little bit later that, yeah, see, the boat made 4 runs, and the first one I wasn't on, so I have to jump down to the second one. We sank a 10,000 ton tanker, a 7,500 ton freighter, a 4,000 ton freighter, 2 of those 4,000 ton freighters, and damaged 2 10,000 ton tankers. And that was I remember that attack the most, because that was very vivid. This was a night attack on the surface, up along French Indochina, or Vietnam, and you've heard of Cam Bay, during the Vietnam War, Cam Bay. Well, these 3 big tankers were coming out of Cam Bay, and they were loaded with gasoline. And they had escort vessels, but this was at night, so we were on the surface, and they did not have radar, or good radar, so they couldn't get us, but we had radar, we knew right where they were. So we made it, you plan these attacks with radar and chart it out, the zig, every zig and every zag, you got on the chart, so you get their estimated course, their thing, but they're zigzagging, but you know which direction. So got that all planned, and we make our attack. We fired 4 torpedoes at the first. We have 6 torpedo tubes in the bow and 4 in the stern. We fired 4 torpedoes from the bow at the first tanker we were shooting at. We swung over and fired 2 torpedoes at the next tanker. We spun around all the way around and fired 4 torpedoes at the last tanker. Now, the first torpedo was our best one. We hit that one with, we fired 4. It could have been hit with 2 or 3, I don't remember, but didn't take many. But we hit it and it broke right in 2. And gasoline all over the water and 1,000 feet in the air, And boy, you said, that's really good. But then, you stop to think, there were human beings running that boat, and you're cheering at all this thing, and you got to stop and think a little bit. So we got credit for that one, which sank, and we think we damaged the other 2, because by that time we had aircraft checking all the convoys going up and down, and they never appeared way up the coast. We think they probably were beached somewhere along the line there. But that was the most vivid, good torpedo attack we had that I remembered.
And you remember your second and third patrols?
Yeah, the second one, we sank, my second one, we had a sub chaser and a freighter and a lugger. This was not a very big one. The sub chaser, I remember, it's a small one. It'd be probably like this McLean we got down here, and it was a big anchorage. It wasn't like a harbor, but it was like a bay with anchorage. And we put the radar in there, and they said, there's a vessel in there, and too small, you couldn't waste a torpedo on. So this is big enough, but it's anchored. It's at night. It's probably anchored for the night. So we said, we can get that. So we spun around, and you cut the diesel engine and flooded way down, and we went by electric motors. We backed into that anchorage, slowly backed in, just backed all the way in there. We had our torpedo tubes manned in the after room. And the head guy, there's a head torpedo man in each room. This head man was in charge of the room, getting it ready there, but he also was a gunner on our deck gun up on the stern, which we had manned. So we backed all the way in, as close as we figured we had to get, and so we stopped, and we fired 2 torpedoes. And then he left the torpedo room and raced through the control room, jumped upstairs and got up on the seat on his gun in time to see the torpedo that he fired, hit that vessel and blew it right out of the water. It didn't hit the guns, but that was a kind of a strange thing. Our skipper was kind of brave. He got a lot of credit and did pretty well. But
what's the key to accurately firing a torpedo? Do you just line it up at like a sight?
Yeah, well, that way you know what's going to go, and you got direction, but you got a gyro that you can put gyro on it. So if if the thing is over here and you want to have a little angle, you can fire it so the gyro will make it turn. That's it's kind of a unique instrument, I'll tell you. There's a lot of precision to it. But you've got your visualize with your torpedo, you know, and you know where it's going to go if it goes true. But during the war, they didn't always do that either.
Yeah, you had said, and I think maybe Don had said also that there's problems with the torpedoes.
Lots of
Mm-hmm.
by the by 45, now they had ironed out a lot of them. But before they ran too deep, and then they would hit and they wouldn't go off, and they had all kinds of trouble like that. They had to finally get that solved, but the Navy guys in charge of torpedoes didn't want to admit that there was anything wrong, so they had to overcome that prejudice there.
Were you ever under attack anymore in your second and third patrols?
Yeah, the worst time we didn't have a lot of depth charge, and we're fortunate. So the early boats during the war, they might be down for 30, 40 hours with depth charging. But this first time that I had it, they only dropped 15. But if you have to kind of look back, the Japs had gone through a lot. Maybe they didn't have as much ammunition and stuff as they had early in the war, so they didn't waste it all. And so they didn't get us, and so they took off with the freighters that protected them. But my last patrol was by that time the war was winding down, and the big ships, or the most of the big ships, had been sunk or damaged or something. So the Japs were using anything to transport things, and so this last patrol we left Fremantle, I think about the 4th of July in 1945, and we were assigned the territory in the Gulf of Siam, and that the Malayan Peninsula comes down here, and Singapore's at the bottom, and Bangkok is way up at the head of that gulf up there. So the Japs were supporting Siam by bringing everything down from Bangkok in any kind of vessel that would go, sailboats and motor sampans and luggers and tugboats and anything. So the Navy had assigned subs all the way along blockading that whole area there. So we were there. It was a short run because we knew the war was ending, so we pulled out. But we about 45 days, and we ended up sinking 63 vessels. That's the most of any submarine in the Navy sank that time. And it was I was on the gun crew there, so you did a lot of action. We'd run out of ammunition, and we'd get ammunition from a sub that was going home, and we'd put it on over with a bridges buoy and bring it over. And probably the most, this same patrol, let me back up just a minute. I have some other friends that were on earlier boats, you know, they're tour guys, and he said, you're a peacetime Navy, that Blenny, you know, the thing. So we elaborate that, and I'd stretch it a little bit. The early boats didn't have it, but we had an ice cream machine. And it said, you had an ice cream machine? Well, no wonder you guys had it so good, you know, that big joke about. But anyway, we left Fremantle, and we were going up that 1,000 miles, and the gear on the ice cream machine broke. And of course, I elaborated to my friend. He said, you know what? We almost turned around and went back home because the gear on the ice cream machine was broke. But we had a lot of efficient guys on the boat. We had a machinist mate that took the head of a ball-peen hammer, cut the part of the head off, put it in the lathe and in the grind. He made a gear out of it and repaired that ice cream machine. So I elaborated big on that and said we could go on patrol because we repaired our ice cream machine. But we got up in the Java Sea, and for some reason they were switching with the controllers in the maneuvering room, and a fire broke out in number 4 main motor. And it was arcing. It wasn't a big blazing fire, but it was arcing inside the motor, so they had to shut it down. And then they looked at it and said, boy, it's bad. The brushes are burned and the rigging is burned. And they seriously debated whether they could go forward with the patrol with one motor out. Said, I think we can fix that. So they put the boat down on the bottom of the Java Sea, 300, let's see here. I got it written down here because I knew I would remember. 372 feet, lay on the bottom all day. And they tore that motor all apart, and the electricians tore all the brushes out that were damaged, and they filed and did whatever they had, and they couldn't get them all repaired, but they could get enough of them that they could get that done. So we after one day on the bottom, they got that thing, And then, just incidentally to that, as you lay down on the bottom all that long, pressure builds up in the boat from the various things. So we were surfacing to try the main motor out, and our skipper went up into the conning tower and cracked the hatch to go up on the bridge. It had enough pressure in the boat that it blew him up, and he rammed his head up on the gang. He had to have 3 or 4 stitches in his forehead and his eyebrow from that. So that was dangerous business. But it fixed the motor, and we went on with the patrol.
Did a fair amount of crew members get hurt in accidents like that?
No, we don't have, there's a kind of a saying that I use, and it's true. We didn't have many Purple Hearts in the submarine service. We just either went all out or all back.
I understand. Yeah.
But no, there are a few injuries. This was incidental injury, but that some guys would, they're clearing the bridge. They could stumble and fall and hurt themselves, but nothing major that we had in our boat. But you never know what's going to happen. When all these guys go through the psychiatric exam to see if they're eligible and everything, and then suddenly they can just snap. We had one fella that was standing a stern plane match. Got a bow plane and a stern plane, the big wheel that's your thing when you're on submerged. And they came over and they had a depth charging, and they had a barometer on the wall that was mounted there, and it knocked it off, the thing, and he caught it in his hand and looked at it and he threw it down. And he left his post and he ran all the way to the stern of the ship, just as far as he could go. He can't go anywhere, Well, he was transferred off as soon as they got into port because, he just snapped. And it can happen to anybody, and that's just the only one that I remember on our boat, but it can happen.
Yeah, the previous gentlemen who were served on subs rarely ever mentioned anything like that. So you get the idea that they did a pretty good job selecting a good crew for that.
They do, but I mean, it can happen to anybody. The last patrol, there's 2 things I want to mention to you. The one exciting thing they're all exciting, but we sank so many beautiful sailboats and stuff, If you had them today, they'd be worth a fortune. They're sailing around here, but if we'd board them, we'd pull up alongside them, and we'd take all the crew off, and they were not Japanese, they were Javanese or whatever, and if they had Japanese material like rice for the army or uniforms or any material for the army, we would sink them because we couldn't take time to unload them. So we'd take the crew off. There maybe be 5 or 6 or 6 or 7. They all get a bag, bundles of stuff, and want to take all their gear with them, So they'd come on board, and we'd sink it with a gun or whatever, and then we'd get maybe 20 or 30 of them. We couldn't handle anymore. The next vessel that was pretty good and big enough, we'd take them all, put them on there. But when we got into port at the end of the war was over then, but we got into Subic Bay, cockroaches. We had cockroaches on ship, but you can fumigate a sub pretty good, close it all up. But, they were swarming all over from all that gear those guys were bringing on board.
Oh, yeah, wow.
But the one thing that the captain always said, I'm going to get me a tugboat. And we're going up the coast, and here comes a tug. And he was pulling 4 fuel oil barges. There were 2 wooden ones and 2 steel ones. They had a big tow. And he saw us coming. He cut the tow, and he headed for the shore. So we headed right after him, but we got into like 35 feet of water. Well, that's dangerous. We can't dive or anything, and we didn't want to go any further. We were firing the guns at him, but he ran the thing aground. He couldn't get it up on the beach, but he ran it aground, and they all jumped off. And I remember just as vividly as today, a guy, I was on the forward gun crew firing, so I could see this. He jumped off the bow and in the water, and he waded ashore, and he got on the beach, and he's running down the beach. We weren't shooting at him, but we had one shell go over the tug and land on that beach and lit behind him and exploded. And you should have seen that guy streak down that beach. It didn't get him, but that scared the daylights out of him. We went back to that thing, and we fired. We had 2 40-millimeter cannons and 2 5-inch guns on our boat. So if we got a 40-millimeter on the stern of the thing here, we used the 40-millimeter, set all those barges on fire. They burned for several days, just that black smoke all over. And the war ended on August 15th. We were in Subic just the day before, but I believe it was on the 7th. August the 7th. That's just 8 days before the war ended. Every morning when you're working with the sub, you make a trim dive because you use fuel and you've got water and waste and everything. You're going to be in good trim when you dive, so we make a trim dive and pump and blow and everything to get it all leveled out. We dove, and we're in a group of islands. We have an SD radar and an SJ radar. The SD is the aircraft radar. We stick up that mast out of the water when we're still submerged, and you would be able to get a little pip on the scope from an airplane. But when you got islands, you get a false pip there. So we had 4 islands there. We had 4 false pips, and unbeknownst to the guy who was watching it, we had a 5th pip. He said, all clear. We surfaced right up, and I was standing in the control room, and by that time the intercom to the bridge has opened up. The captain is the first one up the ladder going up the thing. He opens the hatch, he just gets up on the hitch, and we can hear this plane roaring on the intercom. We surfaced right under a small Japanese plane. That was that 5th pip that we had there. And he had us dead to rights. He dropped the bomb, and it just lit 75 feet off to the side of us, just had a single small bomb. We went down again, of course, but that...
This was your 3rd patrol. This was like right before the war.
This was the last time.
Wow.
Yeah, that was 8 days before the war ended.
Wow.
That's as close as we probably got.
Wow.
And earlier, a little earlier than I was going to tell you too about the time. Maybe, there's 2 things I want to tell you. Maybe they're not important, but one of the subs that was blockading here was the Cod. The Cod is in Cleveland right now as a museum boat, and the Cod had a boarding party on one of these junks. And I think there were about 5 guys. There were 3 of them on board looking over, and 2 linesmen, I think. And I later talked to the linesman that was holding the bow line there, so I know a little bit about that part of it too. But anyway, when they were there, a Jap plane came up over the trees on the island and made a strafing run on him. This fellow holding the bow line, he said, man, I could hear that plane roar, and then I heard the shells hitting the deck. And then he said, I heard the vents on the sub open for the vents for diving. And so I dove over there onto that junk. So they ended up with 5 of the guys on that junk. And the Cod surfaced, submerged there, and the Jap plane hung around. So they couldn't surface again, so they couldn't do anything. So this boat just couldn't sit there, so it had to join the parade heading south. Now, they probably were a long way from Singapore, but that was been the goal. If they ever got there, that's where it'd be, and it wouldn't have been good for them. And they said, we kept asking the crew, we said, could we go ashore and hike across the peninsula? It's fairly wide, but I mean, he said, no, it's jungle, you can't get through there. But they thought they could go along and then go up to Rangoon, because they didn't want to ride that boat all the way to Singapore. No, he said, you won't ever do that. You won't. So as soon as in the evening, the Cod broadcast a message to all the boats that they had 5 guys on a sub, and it was either had a white dog or a white spot on the sail or something to look for. And 2 days later, we came up over the horizon, and there they were. They were so happy to see us. They'd been eating fish heads and rice and stuff, and it really something.
Were you surprised when the war ended, or were you expecting it?
No, we were expecting it. Every morning we would get the radioman would copy the news. They had a news report coming over on the air, and they typed up a message, and they'd be laying on there. And what I remember about the war ending a little bit is that I remember when they fired the atomic bomb on the steel tower out there in Nevada when they tested it. They said it evaporated the whole tower or something to that effect on that message. And I said, well, gee, I didn't know what it was, but that was strange, but I remember that. And then a little bit later, they started talking about the 6th and 7th of August or whatever that was, that when they dropped the first one, and then the second one, then it said the Japs were suing for peace, and they had a white Betty bomber was going to meet here, and so we knew that was all winding down, and we had gotten a message to cut short the patrol and head back towards Subic Bay is where we were headed. So we got in there on the 14th of August. The date line throws the dates off a day, but I'll say we got in on the 14th, and the 15th the war ended. So we were in there that day before, but we knew it was ending there.
Then how long did it take you to get home or discharged?
That's the hard part. Well, I got one more thing to tell you though before we get to that. I was not on this run, but this is kind of an interesting thing. On that first patrol, the Blenny was a brand new boat. They just the skipper was a good skipper, but they were along the coast of Philippines up in there someplace, and they had a nice convoy. I mean, it was a troop transport or something, and boy, it was ideal for them. So they made an approach and everything, and they got all that scheduled thing and ready to fire. And the captain said, "You're getting ready to fire," and well, I'll shorten the story up for you. They had you can have this periscope in low power or high power or something like that. Well, they had it in the wrong one, and that they thought it was in the other one. And he said, "Yeah, it's good." Said, "Get ready to fire." Said, and somebody said, "No, it's not. It's not good." "Yeah, it's good. Fire." They fired. They missed badly. I mean, they missed badly. Why they could do that? Later on, the Japanese guerrillas kept saying they got munitions up in the field up here. "We got munitions up in this field." They said, "No, you can't have it." So they sent somebody out there, and they looked at those. They were torpedoes. I don't know how many there were, but more than one, I think. But they didn't ignite. They skidded up the ground.
Wow.
And they took the serial numbers down, and they tracked them back. They were Blenny torpedoes on that attack. Went up in the field.
I've never heard of that before.
No,
That's pretty
that was
interesting.
kind of a strange thing.
And so how long did it take you
Oh,
to get
yeah, okay,
the
I'll tell you that.
discharge?
We usually, when we'd come in off of patrol, we'd have 2 weeks leave, and the relief crew would repair the ship and everything, but this was short, so we hadn't been out 45 days, so we had 3 or 4 days, and then they said, "Everybody get your good uniforms on," and so we had a measure on top side, and we were tied up alongside of the Sperry, which is a big tender in Zubik Bay. There were 12 submarines there, because they're coming in from all over, you know. So you tie up here, and here be the tender. You'd be subs all tied up. The admiral goes on that first sub and gives a speech, and that sub pulls out, and he gives the same speech in the next one. So he went down. He'd say, "You guys did a good job. You're going home to see your wives and sweethearts, and boy, we won the war, and I'm sure happy, and congratulations," and all that stuff, you know. And we pull out. So the Sperry takes off, and 12 submarines are following it. Went to Guam went to Guam. And we got outside of the Guam harbor, and it kind of hove to a little bit, and the scuttlebutt starts flying, you know, we're gonna do this, gonna do that. I don't know how they get that. Yeah, so finally, the Sperry turned into the harbor, and 6 submarines followed it in, and we were one of them. They said, "Oh, we're just gonna go in overnight." And the other 6 just kept right on going back towards Pearl Harbor and headed home. We got into Guam, we went way down, and I never saw so many ships in the harbor. The war was over by then, you know. There was aircraft carriers, and the battleship Pennsylvania was in a dry dock, and there was heavy cruisers and light cruisers and patrol boats. And just incidentally, we passed a patrol boat going in. It was my best friend from church. I've been with him all ever since, and I said, "That's his boat," but I don't know, you know, the Navy transfers people. But we got down into the harbor, and I didn't really ask anybody. I just left because I knew we were going to be there, and I went down to get the water taxi that you went down, and they took you out all the ships and pulled up alongside this boat. And I thought maybe I'd be able to ask him if he's there and I'd ride him back, but the coxswain stopped. I put my foot on the ladder, and he takes off, and here I'm hanging on the ladder of this boat, and I said, is Bill Boss on board? And I'm glad he said yes. "Yeah, he's here." Well, I hadn't seen the guy in quite a long time, so he was really surprised to see me. I said, "Well, it's good to see you, but I got to get back." He said, "You can't get back." They only had a little motorboat with an outboard motor, because of a little small wooden vessel. He said, "Our motorboat is broken. We can't get up." So I had to spend the night on that thing, and the next night I hitchhiked back. My skip chief of the boat was really upset with me there, but I never saw so many vessels there. But we spent 6 months there after the war. That was the toughest duty of the bunch, because we didn't know what to do. We'd go out and make practice runs, and there'd be a destroyer with green crew member. They'd make practice runs on us submerged, and we fired dummy torpedoes, and then we'd go swimming. But that was hard duty, 6 months after the war.
Okay, we're down to about 2 minutes
Okay,
left.
I'm sorry it takes so much time.
Oh, it's all right. No, it's terrific. Then, when did you finally get back to the
Okay,
States?
we left Guam, went to Pearl Harbor, spent 1 day in Pearl Harbor, went right to San Diego, tied up in San Diego, and they had a little time there. So my friend in the engine room, we took a leave, went up to Hollywood and saw the sights, came back, and I had enough points, got an outgoing unit, and got a troop train, ride a troop train all the way back to Lakes, Illinois. And actually, I went in the same barracks that was my boot camp barracks. That happened to be an office at that time. And I got out on March 6th. I went in and I got on my February the 5th of 45, out March the 6th of 46. And that was all done.
Oh, okay. And you've been working with submarine veterans since the 50s.
Yeah, and I go to the conventions. We still have a boat reunion every time. It's getting and smaller, but we still I see all of my old buddies, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of camaraderie in the submarine crew that.
Oh, I could imagine. The people have spoken quite a bit about that.
Our skipper is dead. He was a young fella. I think he was Annapolis class of 35, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe he was about maybe 37 years old at that time. That doesn't add up just right, but one of the fellows that was in the engine room with me, Pop, we called him, he was 37. He was as old as the skipper. So,
And what have you been doing since the Navy?
I had a lot of time. I didn't like school too much. I could do it, but it just wasn't. I could have gone to any school because I had so many points. I was overseas 22 months. I could have gone to any school. I didn't want to do that, but I came home. My mother was kind of shocked. I was like 21 years old then. I chewed a little tobacco and I drank a little beer, and she said, "What did they do to my young boy?" But my dad says, "You know, you better get some of those rough edges off." So I went down to Davenport College about a year and a half and took some business courses. And then I went into insurance claim adjusting.
Okay.
And then I bought a little insurance agency, and so I was an insurance agent for the rest of my life.
Okay. Well,
I was raised, I got married in 48. We've had 5 children.
congratulations.
You're not going to have any man interviewed this. We have 5 children, all born at home, and I delivered 3 of them with my wife before the doctor got there.
Wow.
That's unusual. You're not going to have any other man tell you that.
Congratulations.
They're all healthy and good too.
Okay, good. Are they in the area or they're scattered around the country?
No, they mostly live around here.
Okay.
My oldest, I have 3 boys and 2 girls. No, 3 girls and 2 boys. My oldest son is the air traffic controller in Chicago. That's far away. The rest of them live right around here.
Okay.
But you know, you get old. One of my daughters was a school teacher. She's already retired.
Oh, congratulations. Sounds like quite a life.
Yeah.
And have ended a minute ago because it's 0.